One question I often see from people using input to learn a language is how should I balance my time between listening and reading? Well, after countless hours, painstaking research, and many a sleepless night I've spent pondering this problem, I've finally come up with the perfect ratio. Are you ready? The perfect ratio is 6.7365 listening to 3.2635 reading. So if you have 2.5 hours, or 150 minutes to spare for immersion during the day, you'll need to spend 101 minutes and 2.85 seconds listening, then do 48 minutes and 57.15 seconds of reading to get the best results. Frivolities aside, the only person who knows the answer to this question is you. Only you know how well you can read and how well you can listen, and how well you want to be able to read and how well you want to be able to listen. Only you know what your motivations and goals are for the language. What are your reasons for learning the language? Are you learning Japanese so you can read comics? In that case, you should focus more on reading. Are you learning Chinese to shock locals on the streets and upload it to YouTube? In that case, you should focus on listening more. Maybe you want to improve both equally. In that case, what do you feel is your strongest skill? Which skill do you feel is lacking more? Spend more time improving that one. No one knows better than you how strong each of your skills is comparatively. It's tempting to look to other people for answers to these questions, but there are some questions that only you know the answer to, and that you'll have to figure out on your own. Everyone has their own goals and reasons for learning the language, and you'll have to consider those and decide what's best for you. With that said, there are some considerations to make that can help you determine how much you should focus on each skill. If you value being able to speak naturally and understand native speed conversation, you're going to need a lot of listening input. So I would recommend putting a lot of time into listening. Reading may help you acquire vocabulary and sentence structure, but there is so much information in audio input that is vital to develop your understanding of conversation and your speaking ability. Tone, cadence, emotion, intonation, speed, pauses, pronunciation, all this stuff you simply can't get from reading. Not only that, different word choices and sentence structures are often used for written and audio input. Natural conversation is spontaneous, less thought out, uses simpler, more everyday words and grammar structures, and is often far less precise and far more wasteful in the way it conveys information. Think about how many times you use filler words and repeat yourself, say the same thing over and over and over again, and use 20 words to express an idea you could have expressed with 10 in writing. How we fundamentally use language while speaking is different from the precise, structured language of the written word. Of course, some of these differences don't apply so much to speech that is heavily scripted or very casual text, the type you'll often see in text messages or on social media. But no amount of reading input is going to get you to the point where you can understand casual native speed conversation and speak freely and naturally on your own unless you're getting a ton of listening input along with it. Likewise, written input has certain characteristics that would be hard to acquire simply by listening. No matter how much listening input you do and how good you become at conversation, by the time you try and sit down with a novel, you'll likely not be able to understand it without great difficulty if you haven't had enough reading input. As I mentioned before, writing generally uses different language to everyday speech. If your goal is to read and eventually write well in your new language, you're going to want to make reading a top priority for the time being. But even if your main goal is to be able to read, I would still recommend getting at least some listening throughout the day, as from my experience, improving your listening skills after learning to read seems to be more challenging than the reverse. Reading something while simultaneously listening to the audio of what you're reading can also be a powerful way to link the written and spoken language and improve your comprehension of both. So ultimately, what are your goals and what do you eventually plan to use the language for? How competent are your reading and listening skills now relative to one another? Once you know the answer to these two questions, it should be clear how much you need of each. The final and equally important consideration is simply what you like doing more. If you don't like reading, even in your native language, but you're forcing yourself to read in a foreign language because you feel you have to, you're doing it out of a sense of obligation rather than pleasure. That's not sustainable. The secret to continuing and succeeding is finding input you enjoy in the language and spending lots of time engaged with that content. This is another thing you'll want to consider when deciding how you want to balance listening and reading. If you're still not sure how you should balance listening and reading, I'd recommend experimenting. Maybe try a day where you read more, then a day where you listen more. See which one you think works better for you. But for the majority of people, I'd honestly recommend not thinking too hard about it. If you feel in the mood to read something, go read. If you feel like watching a show, go do that. If your skills start to become unbalanced, you realize pretty quickly and should be able to take the appropriate measures. Although it can definitely be useful to willfully put your focus towards a certain skill you want to develop, it's also important not to overthink these things and worry too much. Ultimately, the most important thing is getting lots of input in the language, whether that's reading or listening, and making that input enjoyable. So today's was just a short video about a question I often see in immersion learning spaces. Let me know what you think, and if you have any questions, leave a comment. Thanks for watching.